The motive behind the attempted assassination of former U.S. President Donald Trump is still unclear. The alleged shooter, identified as Thomas Matthew Crooks, left no clues, apparently, on why he made the attempt. Crooks was shot dead by the Secret Service, and many questions continue to swirl around the incident, chief among which is how the American Secret Service, that is tasked with Trump's protection, could have missed the plot. For some insights, I'm joined by Devin Barrington-Ward, who's a former candidate for the Georgia State Senate, but is also the managing director of the Black Futurists Group. Devin, good morning to you, and thank you very much for your time. Maybe let's just start off with what your general perspective is on this event that happened before we get into some of the specifics around, how the SS or the Secret Service is trained for outings such as these for someone who is as high profile as the former president of the United States.
Well, generally speaking, I think this is a time where the country is recognizing the ramifications of very hot and oftentimes bombastic political rhetoric that has taken over much of the conversation around the elections and the future of the United States. Mr. Trump has been known to use very inflammatory rhetoric, rhetoric that many would label as potentially inflaming political violence. And so it seems as though he was a victim of some of the rhetoric that he has used in the past. Most famously, there was a time where Donald Trump said that he could, and I'm paraphrasing, he could shoot someone in the middle of a busy street in New York City and he would still be elected president of the United States. And so that type of rhetoric, it leads one to potentially being a victim of that same type of rhetoric when it actually shows up beyond rhetoric and into physical action.
But here's what's curious, though, Devin, in that description is we're not seeing, in terms of what police are telling the public or what the FBI is telling the public so far about this young man, this young Thomas Matthew Crooks, about, what his motivations might have been. If, as you say, the inflammatory, you call it the inflammatory language, the inciting sort of language that you say that Donald Trump has been using and fomenting over these last many months have created a climate that is, potentially responsible for what we saw play out on the weekend. This young person didn't seem to, to either in his social media or the people that knew him, what we know so far, maybe something will materialize in future, connect to that context as a motivating or a catalytic factor in his actions.
Well, yes, investigators have not found a note or any information as of yet, or they potentially may have found that information. They just have not released that to the public. But I still stand by that statement because while we have not necessarily seen an exact motive, what we have seen is that this action is connected to many of the type of rhetoric and inflammatory language that the former president has used in political discourse throughout his tenure as president and as a former president, most famously during the racial justice uprisings in 2020, he instructed his Secretary of Defense to fire upon peaceful, unarmed Black Lives Matter protesters. And so we have seen this type of behavior, this type of language from the former president. And it appears as though that type of language has led to the type of attack that took place at his political rally this past weekend.
Again, we have to wait and see how that, as you and I have both said, these investigations potentially at a very early stage, and perhaps more details will be revealed later on. But from what we know right now, those connections haven't immediately been made, except in the discourse. I want to go to this, Devin. How does someone, and this is one of the questions that is being asked, and you can also share from your perspective, living in the US, what sort of other questions are being asked around this. But the principal one is how this young man managed to come so close to killing a former U.S. president. We know that there were some, eyewitness statements from people after the aftermath, who said that they noticed someone getting onto that building, onto that rooftop with this heavy equipment, alerting security officials around them, and still nothing happened. He was able to get his equipment together. He was able to position himself and then be able to fire off 5 shots from this AR-15, which is a high caliber weapon, legal, we understand, in the US, but was able to do all of this, and no one in the Secret Service could do anything about it.
Yes, so I will say that this is rather unusual. In fact, I was at a protest with folks who were demanding that both presidential candidates call for a ceasefire in the conflict that's taking place in Palestine. At the debate at the CNN Center in Atlanta a few weeks ago, and there were law enforcement staged on rooftops right around the CNN Center and in the heart of the city of Atlanta. And so I found it rather unusual that at this rally, this young man was able to, the shooter was able to take a position on a rooftop that was about 400 yards away from where the former president was speaking. Typically at these type of events in Atlanta, we have presidential candidates that come to the city quite regularly because we are in a battleground state in this upcoming election, and the security perimeters are quite massive. The presence of law enforcement is quite large, and it is very hard to get close to these presidential candidates or other elected officials and VIPs that are attending the events. And so there are lots of questions about how this young man was able to, the shooter, was able to take a position on the rooftop in such close proximity to the former president. In fact, there are reports that are indicating that law enforcement was alerted to this individual's presence with this high-powered weapon at least 30 minutes before the shooting, and that there was another alert that was provided about 1 minute and 30 seconds before the shooting actually took place. So law enforcement was informed. Now, with the security details for these type of events, it is Secret Service, but it is also supported by various state and local law enforcement agencies. And so from my understanding, other agencies were involved with securing the exterior perimeter, which would have included that building. And so there are questions that are going to have to be answered by the Secret Service and the local law enforcement in that small town in Pennsylvania to find out where the breakdown in communication was. One thing that is important to note is that in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania is one of the states that allows open carry, which is a law that allows individuals to not just own these type of weapons, but be able to carry these weapons in the public so long as they are licensed and rightfully purchased. And so part of the challenge that those who are protecting presidential candidates and other elected officials and VIPs is that they are in an environment that is overly saturated with weapons because of the laws around guns that exist at the federal level across the country and the different laws that exist throughout the states. Laws that do essentially allow people to carry around these high-powered weapons in public. Right now, that's something that law enforcement has to deal with in Milwaukee right now, where the Republican National Convention is taking place. It is another state that does allow open carry where people can walk around with these large weapons. So it may have been a situation where they were unsure of whether or not this individual was legally allowed to be in that place with that weapon. But considering where the country is, where the United States is within our political discourse and how the political violence has been on the rise, particularly since the election of Donald Trump, I find it quite confusing that law enforcement did not at least try and speak with this individual prior to the shooting taking place.
When you say it's confusing, Devin, it suggests that there is a whole other layer of of possibilities. And I've seen some of the conspiracy theories online. People were talking about the time it took for the Secret Service to be given the permission to take, a shot at the individual himself. Some of the what seemed to be flaws in the way that entire security detail was handled. What are some of the things, when you say that it's confusing, that you're thinking about when it comes to how this was able to happen in the context you've just described to us?
One of the questions I would want to know again is what was the communication between Secret Service and local law enforcement about this individual who made the decision after the public alerted law enforcement to the presence of this individual with this high-powered rifle at a elevated position. Who made the decision at the initial call at 30 minutes prior to the shooting to not engage that individual, to not walk up to that individual, to speak to them, to find out what their presence was there, whether or not they potentially were confused as another member of law enforcement. So there are questions that are there as it pertains to, where was the breakdown in communication, and was there an intentional breakdown in communication, and why was there an intentional breakdown in communication if that indeed what was to happen? So there's still more information that needs to come out. What I will say is that if something nefarious did take place, either on the part of the Secret Service or local law enforcement, where this individual was intentionally allowed into the space, why? Who stand to gain, who stand to lose? Those are some of the questions that I think myself and other members of the public here in the United States are wanting to have answers to from law enforcement and those who are investigating this shooting.
And there's no doubt, and it's you're setting the scene for the context. It becomes so germane to the context in which this is all happening, an incendiary political climate in the United States right now. So, these two aren't coincidental. I want to go to some of the protocols, and you started off our conversation by talking about some of the work that would have had to have happened in order to secure a site for somebody of the caliber of former President Donald Trump, the collaboration between the various, State Department, Homeland Security agencies, local law enforcement, and so on. I know that there are congressional investigations now that have been launched. Many people are seeking answers for this to establish whether this was a once-off anomaly, whether there are security concerns going forward, and whether there were other forces at play. But we know that and as you said, such a rigorous process in ensuring that a site like this would be locked down. Can you take us a little bit closer to the technicalities? I'm not sure if it's in your wheelhouse or in your purview to do so, but just out of interest, in terms of the height of the building, how many buildings in the area, the various sniper teams and their deployment, the level of security and counter-threat preparation that would have gone into a gathering such as this?
Well, from my experience, again, as a former candidate and someone who works in the political system, so I attend a lot of events that, have this high level of security. Typically, you see an advanced team that comes into whatever site a political candidate, particularly a presidential candidate, is going to be having an event at. And that advanced team is responsible for doing a threat assessment around where are the areas that are most vulnerable for a potential attack, either by a sniper, a gunman in the crowd, a bomb, or some other sort of threat that could be posed by some sort of weaponry used by someone with nefarious intentions. And so the point of the advanced team is to have a better understanding of the environment that they will be bringing that particular VIP into, so that they can better ascertain how to keep that person safe. Once the advanced team has gone there, and part of that advancement is not just the actual venue where the event is taking place, but also the buildings surrounding that venue, for a perimeter that the team will establish based on what they feel is appropriate. A lot of that has to do with the size of the crowd and so on. Once that threat assessment is done, they are then bringing in additional resources outside of the Secret Service to assist with keeping that person, that VIP, safe. And so oftentimes the Secret Service is relying upon the law enforcement capabilities that exist within that particular jurisdiction. They're having that event. So they're looking at state law enforcement, local law enforcement from that particular city or county to provide support in securing that perimeter. Additionally, people who are coming inside of the event are screened for weapons to make sure that no one is coming inside the event with a weapon that could potentially pose a threat to the crowd or to the person that they are responsible for protecting. In this case, it was former President Donald Trump. And much of that also has to do with not just wanting people down or making sure that people go through metal detectors before they enter into the event, but that's also screening the perimeter with Secret Service snipers or snipers from SWAT teams from state and local law enforcement agencies that would be able to scan the perimeter to ensure that there's no folks who are taking a higher position or vantage point from buildings that have a clear line of sight to be able to rain down bullets on the former president or those who are attending the rally.
Right.
And so again, I find that the way that this young man was able, the shooter, was able to penetrate that perimeter, that there are lots of questions that need to be answered because, again, he was just 400 yards away from where the former president was speaking. And so one would assume that 400 yards is a part of that perimeter that is supposed to be locked down. And so the Secret Service is going to have to answer tough questions. We haven't had a threat or an attempted assassination on a president or a former president in quite some time. I believe Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan were the last two presidents who experienced assassination attempts on their lives.
Yeah.
That was over 30 years ago. And so the Secret Service is going to have to answer some tough questions. Recently, we did see the former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi's husband, was attacked by an individual with a hammer who was able to break into their home. And so, again, we are in a heightened environment of political violence. So that is why one would think that the Secret Service and the other agencies that were responsible for providing security at that event would have been hyper vigilant, considering the climate that the country is in at this point.
Devin, 400 yards, 365 meters or so. Not a very, very long distance, visible in an elevated position. Something certainly ought to have been done and should have been done. As you've also just said, hopefully in the course of these investigations, all of them, together, would get some more answers on what the motivation might have been and how some of these anomalies in the security detail will be addressed as well. Thank you very much for talking to us. We really do appreciate your time. Devin Barrington-Ward, Managing Director of the Black Futurist Group and a former candidate for the Georgia State Senate. We'll have news